Kia ora. No mai haere mai. I'm Megan Sety. Somehow I said yes to giving this talk on briefings. And I prefer, I'm like Hugh, I prefer doing this in person and using an interactive style. But I think we found last time that with this many people, it doesn't work well to have a lot of people talking. So we're going to try and do that with the chat feature. So here's your first test run. If people, everybody just hop into the chat and say where you live, and I'll kind of call them out generally as people respond. So we've got some Wellington, some Queenstown. Cool. Ooh, lots of Welly folks. That's good. Rotorua, Christchurch, Whanganui. Anyone else? Tauranga, this is great. Queenstown, there we go. Cool. So just keep them coming in. And this is helpful. If you keep using the chat feature, then I won't call on people to participate. And if you don't use the chat feature, I'll call on people. So it behooves you to write into the chat. As Martin said, today's session is on briefings. And if you know PRANZ or you know Martin, you know this is going to involve acronyms. And more than that, this has got acronyms embedded in acronyms. So it's an exciting talk. We're going to use the acronyms as a bit of a scaffolding for the talk. And I'll talk a little bit about if you're like me and you're not good at remembering the acronyms, how to work around that. But before we go any further, a little bit of a test run of our interactive approach here. Why do we do briefings? So can I just get people to drop into the message why you think we should do briefings or why you do them? And no answer is a wrong answer. Everything is fine. So safety, teamwork, we're all on the same page, more safety. River culture, setting expectations, more safety, yeah, common theme. Communication on the river. Ask how many beers people brought, that's important. Breaks the ice, bonding. Cool, so well done, there's quite a few in there. The aim for today is about setting a high standard for the briefings, and it's kind of the gold standard. So in particular, thinking about if we're in PRANZ events, sort of covering every detail. And part of that is setting a norm for the pack rafting community. But briefings should be done anytime you get on the river. I think if you don't do a briefing, as many people said, that briefing is about being on the same page so that when you go down the river, you kind of all know where you're starting from. So even if it's the same people you always paddle with on the same river and the same gear, and you think nothing has changed, when you show up to the river, every time something is different for whoever is there. Maybe they had too many beers the night before. Maybe it's been 6 months that they've paddled. Maybe they got a new helmet, who knows? But you don't know that if you don't have that conversation. And if you don't have that briefing, then you basically get on the river on a lot of assumptions, and assumptions never go well with risk. So that's kind of a defining reason to have those briefings. So briefings really vary. Like I said, we're going to go through the gold standard drawing on the acronym, but they can be anything. And I actually think, I know Martin put this slide deck together. Thank you for making my life a little bit easier. So it won't surprise you that this was Martin's question. But I actually think this is a really important question for a briefing, and it's kind of knowing how people are when they're coming to the river. And I guess a really good example of how briefings can vary. 2 weeks ago, we did the Tararua pack rafting event. The weather was terrible, rivers were exceptionally high. We broke into small groups, and I was in a group of about 6. Most of us knew each other pretty well for the most part. So when we did part of our briefing, we changed our introduction to be specific to the group. So people didn't talk about necessarily the details of their experience because we kind of knew that a little bit about each other. Instead, everyone talked about how they were feeling for that particular day and what it was that they were kind of focusing on for the river, particularly given that the river was really high. It was a really cold day. So you kind of adapt things based on who's there. So I'm going to cheat. So I promised Martin that I wouldn't go too rogue on this talk, but I'm going to cheat a little bit. We filmed a video that was like a staged briefing, but if you were in the session a couple weeks ago, the videos are a bit stilted and they don't run really well. I also, again, am a big fan of interaction. So we're going to do like a pretend briefing here a little bit. And this is also a good example of, I have a hard time remembering the acronyms because I am still quite a learner in the pack rafting community, and it's a lot of information for me to remember. And when I'm standing on the river, there's about 50,000 things going through my mind, and it's hard for me to remember all the acronyms. So my cheat for remembering everything in a briefing is to actually use the knowledge of everyone in the group and to ask people, what should we cover in the briefing, to get people to kind of serve up topics and ideas. So let's do a little bit of a test run before we even get into our acronyms. I've got a little checklist here. If I can get people into the chat group to cover, like right in there, what topics or things, could be like a big topic or a small thing, you think should be covered in a briefing. And I'm going to see how much we cover of the whole acronym. So signals, communication. I'm ticking them off on my list. Are you nervous today? Who has what safety gear? Who has the PLB? Who's your buddy? Known hazards, rescue equipment. Somebody's got capsizing in there, medical issues. Hugging the rock. This is good. Weather. Yep. Yep. Taking out. So like where you're going to get out. First aid training, first aid kit, emergency exits. Any concerns, conditions, outline of the trip, expectations? Anything else? Signals, yep. We're pretty good, but there is something that hasn't totally come up yet. Boat hazards, current injuries, any holes in your boat? Yeah. That's a fair question. Who has run this before? So experience. Yep. There's one we've kind of tapped it. Yep. Did you bring your inflation bag, Ben? This is good. Okay, you've done pretty well. I feel like of the acronym, the one that kind of got missed a little bit is the B, but we'll go through the whole acronym and you can test and see how much you remembered. But I think this also really highlights, there's a huge amount of knowledge in this group. And I think I kind of wanted to draw on that rather than spending all my time talking. Ooh, good. Spare paddle and gear. Yeah. So one of the B's in here, repair kit, was your boat and all your equipment around your boat, and leadership. So people are still messaging in the chat things, which is great. So I skipped the video. That was my cheater version. And I'll just say before I kind of really jump into the acronym, if you haven't noticed, I talk fast. I've also know we've only got 40 minutes before we're going to be dropped off. So I'm going to cover a lot of stuff quick, but please feel free to pop questions into the chat and I'll try and pick them up as I go. I've got it in front of me so I can kind of see them as they come in. And if there's anything that doesn't get covered in sort of the briefing that we go through, we'll talk about that at the end. And just before I go next, so we've talked about a couple different ways about how to remember the briefing and everything you covered. So the obvious one is the acronym, and we're going to go through that as a scaffolding of like your checklist of things to cover. I've talked about my cheat, which is asking everyone else in the group to help me remember the things we need to cover. Any other ideas for how you kind of remember everything you need to cover in the briefing? What kinds, go ahead and pop it in the chat. What do you do to help you remember the stuff you need to cover before you get on the river? Laminated card with the dot points. Yeah. So if it's a PRANZ event, we should have a PRANZ intention sheet. And if you've ever, I know most of us sign in and don't look at it, but the top of the PRANZ intention sheet has all the details of stuff you need to cover. It's good to kind of glance over that. It's amazing what you forget. So as we start to talk through, they must know where the get out is. I agree, Hugh. Before you get on the river, you should know where you're getting off. As we talk through some of this stuff, it's really good to be thinking about your own experiences and conversations and how you remember all the things that you need to cover. Yeah, Kelvin's added in another way of remembering things is having a trip plan for a multi-day trip. Cool. So if you're doing a multi-day trip, hopefully there's a really big trip plan, and part of that should be all the details that you kind of need to cover before you get on the river. So now we'll get to the stuff we've all been waiting for, the acronym. It starts out pretty easy, hopefully. So the first one is me, is introducing yourself. You can use kind of any format for this. In this example, you could use a traditional mihi, the Maori greeting. I think it really depends on the trip and the river and what you're doing. And the thing to think about when you're doing an introduction is role modeling and setting a tone for the whole group. And particularly if you're in the Kaiarahi role, you kind of want to use this introduction to help set you up for the rest of the group introducing themselves. So someone actually had a really good example in one of the chat sessions just back, where usually when you do an introduction, personally, I'm really bad with names. So I'm a big fan of always doing names, even if you think you know everyone. And then having a couple of questions that are pretty specific to try and elicit the information that you might want to know about the people you are about to get on the river with. So a really great example of a specific question is, are you anything you're nervous about today? And that can be really good if you're paddling with people you don't know or paddling with people who are inexperienced. And often people will reveal things that you might not have even considered or be aware of. And you can address it even before you get on the river, or something for you to think about while you're on the river. Other things you can always ask about experience, but it's helpful to give more specific questions, like what was the most recent river you've paddled? When have you paddled a river like this one? How are you feeling today? Those are actually quite good questions. Any other questions that people use when you're doing this introduction? You can throw those in the chat. I'll wait a couple minutes for people to put those in. Who's done this run? Asking people's hopes and concerns. Yeah, both are really good, actually. It's really interesting to know what people's expectations are. What do you want to learn today? What's going to be new about this for you? That's a great question, AJ. Like, it's really helpful to know what someone might be doing for the first time. Something that's really great about these questions too is that they're really open-ended and they're also non-judgmental. You kind of really want to encourage people to share in a way that's supportive and encourages everyone to say what their weaknesses and their strengths are, so that you can work with that as a group. So that's kind of thinking about introducing yourself and using those questions to set the tone. The next thing in the acronym is the why for you, and that's going around the whole group and getting everyone to introduce themselves. So next up in the acronym is awa. So this is the te reo Maori word for river. And this is our first acronym embedded in an acronym. So I love Martin and his acronyms. They're awesome. So raft is a good one here, but basically this is the river. So what do you need to know about the river? People have mentioned them already in the briefing, but it's the obvious thing about the forecast of the flow as well as the weather. So are you getting on when it's raining and when it's hot? What's the temperature like? The access, Hugh said it right from the start. Where are you getting out? I don't know if anyone's mentioned emergency exits yet, but this is big. Features, so any crux, rapids, or hazards, and time, how long is on the run. And I think some of this is really good to recapture at the start of rafting, because at the start of getting on the water, because often we spend a huge amount of time thinking about these things in the decision to go paddle. So people will try and assess whether or not they've got the skills to be on that river. If you're in Wellington, we spend a huge amount of time watching the rain and the flows. And often you forget about all those things when you actually get right to the pressure point of getting on the water and people start paddling. And it's not like till 15 minutes later that someone's like, oh yeah, where was that grade 3 rapid? So it's kind of just like hitting the reset button of like, before we step on the water, this is what we're all thinking about. Hugh's thrown in a great Great comment that no group has all the paddlers of equal skill level. So constantly assessing the overall capability of the group. I think that's so true. In fact, the questions that we all just talked about having in the briefing, you can keep asking questions the whole time on the river. So keep checking in with people and asking how things are going, if their expectations are changing, how they're feeling, etc. Another thing I'll add on this one that's really good. Again, I have a hard time remembering things. So I know that someone suggested using a laminated card, which is a great idea sometimes to take that kind of information with you on the river. You can also put it on your phone. So if you use like a Topo Map app on your phone, you can drop pins of takeout points and have that in a waterproof case. And it's really good before you get on the river to know who has that info at hand so that you don't have to dig it out. Who's got a watch, who can check the time. B, for boats and bits. So this is pretty much the gear check. And this is the one that actually there weren't a whole lot of suggestions when I asked what we covered in a briefing that came up on this. There was a small number in here. So let's do a bit of a test run again, because there's actually like 7 or 8 slides on boats and bits. So let's test us. In the chat, put in what should be covered in a briefing or checked before you get on the river in boats and bits. Yep. Is the boat leaky or soft? Your footwear? Yeah. Helmets? Is your gear tied on maybe? PFD is fitted. Snag hazards for feet. Yes, Wayne, cool. There's a lot. There's 10 slides here. So there's more. What other boats and gear, what things about your boats and gear do you think about? Your grab lines? I think this is one that often gets missed. And if you're running a PRANZ event and paddling with people you haven't paddled with before, you actually need to think a lot about gear. Whether people have a running leash or no leash, a repair kit, whether the boats are properly inflated. Hugh, great suggestion for thinking about this, starting at the head and working your way all the way down the body in terms of whether or not your equipment that you're wearing on you is all correctly ready. Thigh straps, yeah. Do they fit? Are they easy to get out of? So I'll jump into some of these. And I will say, I think it's really easy if you hop on the river with a group of people you know well, or you think are experienced, to assume that their gear is okay. But one of the things to remember is a lot of us are still developing our skills and upgrading our gear, and people are constantly coming with new gear or refined gear. So you see people trying new boats, adding thigh straps in, switching into dry suits, changing their paddle. So it's worth when people asking about gear, even with experienced people, just because gear is always changing. Ooh, there's some more suggestions coming in. Thigh straps, throw ropes, rescue gear, carabiners, pin kits, knives, whistles. Oh, this is good and good. Do people look comfortable in the gear? That's actually pretty fair. Footwear. Yeah, there's a good one in here, Stu. That's right. Is your dry suit zipped up? This comes back to Hugh's comment about looking at people's clothing and what they're wearing. Yeah, fair enough, Amy. Who's in a wetsuit and who's in a dry suit? I think that is so true in a PRANZ event. When you show up, especially when it's a huge one with a lot of people, you see a huge range of people wearing varying levels of clothing to stay warm. And often, if you're more experienced, you tend to be the person who's warm, but often the people in your group might not be because their gear is not great. So kind of need to pay attention to that. All right. So I'm going to kind of rip through some of these pretty quick because I think you guys have covered a lot of it. Under the bits, helmets. I won't go into heaps on any of this. So if you have questions, ask. But basically, bike helmets and climbing helmets are not ideal, really not acceptable, because they only take one impact, and they're also not designed for the diversity of impact that you would get if you were underwater hitting huge numbers of rocks. They also don't have the same level of protection for the forehead and the front of the face that you would get from like a kayaking or whitewater helmet. People bring them anyways. Handy thing to do if people show up and you're about to get on the water and they don't have the gear that you wish they had. If you're at a PRANZ event, shout out loud and ask if anyone has spare. There is frequently spare stuff floating around, and you can often substitute out gear. PFDs, lots of people mentioned this. So making sure they're fitted well, do a buddy check. That you should, if you need to rescue someone, you should be able to pull them in by the shoulder straps. That they're clean, they're not going to get caught on anything, whether that's getting back into their boat or if there's an entrapment hazards, that they're visible, and that they are appropriate for the water. And one of the things I think is really something useful to think about is in pack rafting, we see a lot of motley of gear. It's totally reasonable to ask someone about their gear if you're not sure. So it's okay to be like, hey, I've never seen a PFD like that. Is it rated for whitewater? Yeah. Is it suitable for the buoyancy, etc.? Footwear. I know several people in this group have experiences with this, but obviously appropriate footwear to be able to walk out if something goes wrong. I mean, even for scouting, you also want appropriate footwear if you swim. So you need to, if you're thinking about a defensive swimming position and feet up and sort of not, and being able to push into rocks, but also being able to swim with what you're in. So the examples of footwear that are positive here are not huge tramping boots, something to think about. Big boots are not ideal to swim in. They're also sometimes can be an entrapment hazard. So you want closed-toed shoes that have some sort of a surface that is acceptable for walking on, but you don't want like a really hardy, intense boot. Feel free to throw in comments as I'm going as well if I'm missing stuff. Ropes. Cool. So a good example, Martin's just thrown in an example of how to talk about things by getting each person in the group to talk about a piece of gear. And you can even get people to talk about their own piece of gear, which will highlight issues as you go around the group. Hughes pointed out with shoes, hard heels will punch holes in pack raft floors. With throw ropes, I think this is, for me, it was a real learning experience because I came from a whitewater background in big rafts on big rivers where people are rescued from the boat, not from the shore. So in those scenarios, throw lines were always available on the boat because you immediately rescued someone from the boat. But in pack rafting, you're not likely to be throwing a throw rope from your pack raft, right? You're going to be on the shore in a particular position, ready to rescue someone. So your throw rope should not be a hazard to you while you are paddling. So Martin's got some great photos here of tidy throw ropes and then ones that are not so tidy, so here's examples of ropes that are just loose, or ones that are not rated, or they're just not possible to hold on to. And we've done this on some PRANZ events before. We've gotten everyone to get their throw rope out and try them and see if they can actually hold on to them under the force of water. And some of those ropes are not possible to hold on to. So it's worth trying them. Carabiners, I think this is a really common one I see with people when they're kind of first just jerry-rigging their boats together. So using open carabiners, so non-locking carabiners can become an entrapment hazard. And there's also some examples of sort of like, your hardware store budget brand carabiners that aren't rated. So it's worth talking to people about this. If you're right about to get on the water and you look at people's boat and notice this kind of stuff, try to swap things out. Ask if other people in the group have gear that you can swap from. See if you can remove the equipment from their boat for the paddle, but also talk to them about a gear. Because I think I was on an event once where we had someone paddle down who had gear rigged in a way that would have been an entrapment, and no one was said to that person. It was just kind of a rushed day and things didn't get said. That person showed up on another event, similar setup. And at that time, a Kaiarahi said to them all, and explained that's an entrapment issue and helped them sort out the situation. And at the time he said, oh, I was on another event and no one told me this was a risk. So I think for new people, often there's so many things that we don't know about these risks. If someone doesn't bring it up, even if you can't fix it at the point in time, talking to them about it is part of helping them understand that it's something they need to resolve later. Team gear, depending on what the trip is, you might want to talk about team gear, like what you've got. It's good to know where the PLBs are, the first aid kits. It's good to know if people have whistles on them and whatever else you might need for the scenario. CLAPS, our second acronym embedded in an acronym. Luckily for me on this one, the bottom 4 letters of that acronym are going to be covered in another session. So not me. So you can right now just focus on claps for communicate, but it also covers these other areas around line of sight, avoiding hazards, position, and safety. And this is pretty much how are you going to move when you go down the river? Like, how are you going to run the river? So under communication, you guys all hit on this at the very beginning when I asked you what the point of a briefing was, because it came up quite a lot in terms of signals and talking about them. They're different from different groups and people from different backgrounds. So it's worth having these conversations. So I'll skip over some of this because this will be covered in the next sessions. So D covers Dr. Didymo. You get 2 out of this D. So one is doctor, important medical information, and the other one is Didymo. And in group settings, I've kind of found sometimes it's hard to ask people about medical info because you kind of put them on the spot for disclosures. So you can say to people, does anyone have any medical emergencies or information we need to know? It's also on the intentions sheet. So just make sure if you're a Kaiarahi, reread that intention sheet after everyone has signed in, but also you can ask people to come to you. So you can sort of say, hey, if anyone has any medical things we need to know about, if you feel like sharing with the group, that's great. If you don't, could you just let me know separately, come have a conversation with me. Cool. It's also helpful, I'll just add on here. It's also helpful to know who else has first aid training in the group. And then Didymo, we should all be talking about Didymo. And this is probably more, it's useful at the start of a briefing, but it's also good when you're coming off the river. So that got me through the acronym and I still have 10 minutes to go. Yes. So again, any gaps in anything that we've covered, anything that we didn't go over that kind of sort of came through in the acronym of my ABCD. Cool. Agreeing the order to paddle in and spacing out. So that's like that whole area about how are you going to run the river? And that'll get covered in a bit more detail. But I think it is a really important thing to talk about how you're going to run the river and kind of what's expected behavior. Stuart added in appointing a navigator and checking for complex rivers and walks. So again, like how are you going to run the river? How are you going to scout? Are you going to river scout? Are you going to pull over? How are you going to decide when to scout? So Martin added in getting someone green to give the briefing and helping them as a group can be good. So yeah, that means asking other people if they want to give the briefing. It's a great way for people to practice. Hugh has suggested getting everyone to sit down while you brief them and then they'll pay attention. I agree, Hugh. One of the things I find that happens is like everyone goes and puts their boats in the water to temper them. And then you do the briefing. And like by then half the group is in the water, not in the water, tying their shoelaces. You've lost them already. So sometimes you kind of need to step away from the river before you do this. Yeah, setting expectations around things like portaging and where the limits will be. I think that is a really important thing to cover. We did this, the small group that I was with when so 2 weeks ago on the Tararua run, we did the Akatarua and our group just did the Akatarua. And we talked about the fact that there were 2 areas that we thought we would need to scout. And at that point established that there was a high likelihood that all of us would portage it because the weather and the conditions were not very good and no one wanted to swim that day. And it helped us make the decision to actually portage it when we were there. We were debating whether to run it because it's really hard. It looks really fun. But then we kind of remembered our initial conversation at the briefing. Identifying who is the leader, the first paddler, and who will be the tail end Charlie. So yeah, so if you talk about how you're going to run the river, if you're not using rolling cover, so if you're going to have a set person at the front and a set person at the back, agreeing that, and also agreeing how you're going to communicate and check in with each other. If you're in groups of 6 or 7 people, it's quite easy to be spread out, and the person at the back might never be able to talk to the person at the front if you don't make an effort to communicate together. Martin's added in, stopping and discussing things that go wrong at the time is good. So yeah, having a check-in, like when something hasn't gone right, kind of pulling off the river, having a snack break, and having a conversation about what happened and what's going to be, what you want to do differently moving forward while you're on the river. And Martin kind of hit at something else, which is the post-paddle debrief. I think I find this interesting in PRANZ events, because especially huge events, often like we're so rushed getting off the river, we're trying to shuttle boats back, people are cold, they want food. We kind of just get off the river and move. And the debrief happens far more informally, and often back like when we're having dinner or drinks. And I actually think it's worth pausing and taking 10 minutes with your group that you were paddling with right when you get off the river. Like that's the moment in time when you're all there and things are really fresh in people's mind. You'll keep talking about it later. We all do, because in fact, many of you are still talking about things even in the chat group. But I think it's worth remembering to have this post debrief right after you get off. Yeah. And also making sure no one gets left behind with no shuttle in the cold. Maybe speaking from personal experience there. Yep. And then debriefings have continued. So you don't have to debrief just in person. You can debrief after we've done that through message groups or emails or other more formal settings. Okay. Any questions before we go? Or Martin, do you want to jump in and wrap anything up?
No, I'm good. That was awesome. I think it would be good if people had further comments to just drop them on the Facebook event, and we can sort of have a bigger discussion there, which is a little freer flowing without the time pressures of Zoom. So like drop your comments in there. Let us know what you thought. Awesome.
Also, if you get shoulder tap to do this, you should say yes, because Martin does the slides for you and everything.
Except for Kelvin. Don't tell Kelvin that, because I haven't done his slides. Kelvin, you're up next. And Kelly, I haven't done her slides, so.
Well, now the expectation is set.
She's here, so she knows she's doing it now.
Yeah. And I just want to say, obviously, huge thanks to the group, because there was a huge amount of knowledge coming through in the chat. So I feel like any one of you could have done this. So that also means you should be ready to be shoulder tapped, because clearly you all have the knowledge to be jumping in and helping out with these sessions.
Yeah, and we're not dictating that this is how you have to do it. We're just saying this acronym's a useful tool for doing it, and that we really want to get this culture. Look, Megan had to pull me aside on our last paddle and say, Martin, we're going to do a safety briefing before we run the Hutt Gorge, aren't we? And I was like, oh, yes, we are, of course. So, like my safety briefings are pretty limited when it's crew I know. On a PRANZ event, we go over the top, and we know we go over the top, but we must do that to set the example and make sure people's kit is safe. So we're probably going to drop off any minute now. Thanks everyone for coming. That was awesome.